Exclusive videos, story continuations, and bonus content are already available on Boosty before YouTube, so check the link in the description for early access to all new recaps and continuations. Jang Min-jun died on Thursday at 2:23 p.m. local time after hitting the back of his head on a shelf of canned goods. He slipped on the wet linoleum floor of a supermarket near his home and passed away without a word. The death was so absurd that not even an obituary was published, just a report and a locker number. Then he opened his eyes and smelled the scent of bleach and hot blood at the same time, and everything came flooding back. The ceiling was white. The ceiling of a hospital ward is always white in any world and in any life. Someone was screaming behind the wall. Once, briefly, and then immediately silence, which is worse than any scream. Min-jung didn't have time to figure out where he was or when he was, but his hand had already found the scalpel on the table to his right. His fingers closed around the handle of their own accord before his mind could ask even a single question. The door shook from a blow from the outside. He sat up in bed. He noticed the IV drip in his hand and ripped it out. The second blow was stronger than the first, and from the sound, it was clear that it wasn't a person waiting for an answer who was striking. Min-hun stood up. His legs held him steady. He took a step back toward the wall opposite the door and steadied his breathing. The hinges snapped on the third blow, and the door fell inward flat, raising a cloud of chalk dust. The infected man weighed about 90 kilograms and moved in a straight line without a single pause and without a thought. Min-hun stepped to the left. The scalpel entered the base of the neck from the side at an angle he already knew. The body passed by on inertia, slammed into the wall, and slid down without making a single new sound. His hands didn't tremble. It was important to note this. His hands didn't tremble, and that meant the body remembered. The corridor greeted him with the smell of burnt plastic and motionless bodies along the left wall. 3 infected at the nurses' station moved slowly with their backs to him, the usual type from the first wave. A 4th stood by the window at the end of the hall, looking out, and this one was more dangerous because he could hear. Min-hun turned and walked the other way, not because he was afraid, but because there was no point. The stairwell turned out to be clear. He went down 2 flights and exited through the emergency exit. The fire escape held. The asphalt of the courtyard was empty and gray under the pale sky. He stopped by the trash cans, leaned against the cold metal wall, and closed his eyes. The memory came in a wave, cold and clear and complete, like a file that had long been waiting to be opened. He had already lived through this. He had already seen how it began, first on the news, then in the windows across the street. In that life, he had died at these very hospital gates, trampled by the crowd on the 5th day of the outbreak. Today was day 1. He knew it by the smell of the air and by the fact that the sirens hadn't fallen silent yet. He had 73 hours before the virus ceased to be a city problem and became a global one. Jang Min-jun looked at the scalpel in his hand. There was someone else's blood on the blade, and that no longer mattered. What mattered was something else. The pharmacy at 14 Cheonno would open in an hour, and it would have what he needed right now. He knew where the next outbreak would occur. He knew when the power would go out in the Eastern District, in 11 hours. He knew which of the people he would meet would survive and which would break, and that knowledge was cold fuel. He smiled quietly, not because it was funny, but because now he had everything except time. He walked across the courtyard toward the side exit without looking back at the hospital windows behind him. 14 Cheonno was an 8-minute walk if he went through the market instead of along the main street. Min-hun chose the market. There were fewer people and more shadows there, and the infected didn't like narrow passages. He tucked the scalpel into the pocket of his lab coat. The coat wasn't his and was 2 sizes too big, but that didn't matter now. The time was 9:41 a.m. There were 49 minutes left until the pharmacy closed, and he walked at a steady pace, neither hurrying nor slowing down. The market was almost empty. 2 vendors were packing up their goods in silence, staring at their phones with pale faces. A radio from someone's stall was talking about the quarantine in the northern districts and recommending that people stay home. Min-hun had heard that radio broadcast once before. Back then, he'd stayed home too, and that's what killed him in the end. He walked past the stalls without stopping or looking up, because eye contact draws attention. The pharmacy was closed. The metal grill was half lowered. The owner was leaving but hadn't left yet. The light was on inside. Min-jun bent down and walked under the grill, then stood at the counter with his back straight. The owner, Lee Bo-min, judging by his name tag, was standing by the shelf of pills, looking at his phone screen. He was about 55 years old, with the hands of a man used to counting rather than running, and that was a good thing. Lee Bo-min looked up. He started talking about closing time and how now was not the time for shopping. He said he'd heard about the nearby hospital and that it would be better for everyone to stay home until the authorities made an announcement. He spoke at length and with conviction, and every word showed that he still believed in the authorities' announcement. Min-jun waited for a pause and recited a list, exactly 9 items, without explanation or preamble. Broad-spectrum antibiotics, adrenaline in ampules, tourniquets, at least 10 of them, surgical sutures in 2 sizes, 4 vials of betadine, 2 kilograms of activated charcoal, analgesics, tramadol or morphine if available behind the counter, dressing materials, no limits, naloxone in case of overdose in the field, and all the powdered electrolytes you have. Lee Bo-min was silent for about 5 seconds. Then he said that this sounded like preparation for war, not for quarantine. He said he wouldn't dispense tramadol without a prescription, that the pharmacy was closing, and that they should go to the hospital. Min-hun looked at him calmly and said that the hospital 300 meters from here was already closed. Lee Bo-min opened his mouth, closed it. He looked out the window, where a plume of smoke was already visible in the distance. Min-hun placed everything he found in the pockets of his robe on the counter, his phone, his keys, and 47,000 won in cash. He said the money wasn't much, but the phone was unlocked and had apps that were worth more. He said Lee Bo-min had 3 options: to sell it, lend it, or refuse and be left alone. He added that the 4th option was to wait until the grate outside was lifted without asking. Lee Bo-min stared at the trail of smoke for another 4 seconds. Then he went behind the glass partition. He gathered the items silently and carefully and packed them into 2 large bags without looking at Min-jun. His hands didn't tremble. Min-jun noted this separately. The pharmacist's hands didn't tremble, and that was acceptable. He already knew that Lee Bo-min would survive the first 2 weeks, and that meant the man was suitable. The bags weighed about 8 kilograms each. Min-jun picked up both and slung them over his shoulders. He told Lee Bo-min that he shouldn't stay here and that in 6 hours the neighborhood would become dangerous. He gave an address, 38 Taehakno Street, 3rd floor, and said there would be water and locked doors there. Lee Bo-min asked who he was. Min-jun was already heading for the exit and didn't turn around. Outside, the air was colder than it had been 5 minutes ago, and the band of smoke had grown wider and darker. The time was 10:22. There were exactly 10 hours and 38 minutes left until the power went out in the Eastern District. He smiled, not because things were going well, but because the list was complete and the rhythm hadn't been broken. The next stop was the construction warehouse at 77 Mapodero, and he needed transportation to get there, not his own 2 feet. Transportation was simple if you didn't think about the law, and complicated if you thought about it for too long. Min-jun didn't think about the law. He thought about the warehouse at 77 Mapodero, and the fact that it was a 4-kilometer walk. 8 kilometers on his shoulders with 16 kilograms of medicine isn't walking. It's a waste of time. The time was 10:24. He turned the corner of the pharmacy and stopped at a parking bay along the sidewalk. 4 cars. An old Hyundai Porter with no door lock. He'd checked it with a glance from a distance. A pickup truck was more practical than a sedan because the warehouse meant not just 1 trip or 2, but more. Minhun set the bags down on the asphalt. He pulled a metal IV clamp, flat and rectangular, out of his lab coat pocket. The door opened in 8 seconds. He tossed the bags behind the seat, got in, and closed the door without a slam. He found the wires under the steering column in 30 seconds, not because he knew how to do it before, but because he remembered. In his past life, he'd spent 20 minutes on this, and in those 20 minutes, he'd lost 2 people close to him. The engine started. He pulled out of the parking lot smoothly, without a jerk, and merged into the sparse morning traffic. The streets were strange, neither empty nor crowded, but frozen as if before a storm, when the birds are silent. Mapodero was 2 traffic lights and 1 railroad crossing away, and Minjung knew where the traffic jam would be. The crossing, there were already 7 cars there and the barrier was down, though there was no train and none was expected. He turned into the courtyards a block before the crossing and emerged onto a parallel street through a passageway. The warehouse at 77 Mapodero came into view 4 minutes later, a 3-meter-high gray fence and a gate chained shut. 3 people were standing by the gate. Not infected. People. 2 men and a woman with a shopping bag. They were pounding on the gate with their fists and shouting that someone was inside and to open it immediately. Ming Jun stopped the truck 20 meters away and watched them for 30 seconds without getting out. He smiled quietly, because he saw what they didn't. The gate was opening not from the outside, but from the inside. He got out. He picked up the bags and walked toward the gate past the 3 of them without stopping or slowing down. One of the men, a young man of about 25 with a broken knuckle, turned around and started talking. He said they'd been there first, that they'd been knocking for an hour, and what the hell was this guy pushing his way in for? He spoke loudly, with the confidence of a frightened man who confuses anger with strength. Minhun didn't answer him. He walked over to the left gate post and found the right spot on the frame with his fingers. There was an emergency lever, the KPD-3 series warehouse standard, installed on all facilities prior to 2019. He pushed the lever down and pulled the gate toward him, and it opened without a single extra effort. The young man fell silent mid-sentence. The woman took a step back. The second man watched, holding his breath. Inside the warehouse, it was dark and smelled of machine oil and damp concrete, with a bitter scent hanging in the air. Mingzhan stepped inside, waited for his eyes to adjust, and found the light switch on the right wall. The fluorescent panels flickered and lit up, revealing shelves reaching to the ceiling and narrow work aisles. Reinforcing bars, roofing metal, fasteners in bulk in open crates, generators in the far corner, 2 of them. He took stock of the inventory with his eyes and numbers, without speaking. 4 rolls of chain-link fencing, 50 meters each. Sheet metal, 2 millimeters thick, about 30 sheets along the left wall under a tarp. Cement in 50-kilogram bags, about 40 bags by the far wall with no signs of dampness. Generators, DGU-15 and DGU-30 diesel models. Whether the fuel is stored separately or not, that needs to be checked. 3 people from the street followed them in and stood at the entrance, looking at the shelves with that particular silence. Minhun knew that silence. It's how people are silent when they first realize that the world has truly changed. The woman was the first to pull herself together. She asked what was going on here and who he was anyway. Her voice was steady. Her hands weren't shaking. She held her bag with both hands like an anchor. Minjung looked at her, then at the young man with the broken knuckle, then at the second man. The second man was over 45, with a short haircut and that closed-off demeanor you can't buy. A soldier, or a former soldier, judging by the way he stood at the entrance, keeping both corners in view at the same time. Minjung gave the address as 38 Taehak Row and said they needed help there and that no one was going for free. The young man opened his mouth again, asking who gave him the right to give orders in someone else's warehouse. Minjung was already looking at the generators and estimating the weight and size of the porter's cargo bed behind the gate. He said one sentence without turning around. In 10 hours, there would be no electricity here. The young man said nothing more. The former soldier was already walking toward the far shelves to inspect the generators. The former soldier's name was Quan Tae-young, and he checked the generators methodically, like a man who had done it 1,000 times. He opened the cover of the DGU-30, checked the oil, sniffed the dipstick, and closed the cover without a single unnecessary movement. Then he stood up and stated the figures himself without being asked. A full 45-liter tank plus two 20-liter cans nearby. Minhun watched him and thought that people like this, in their first life, either save everything or break everything. The woman's name was So Eun-ji, and she was no longer standing at the entrance. She was walking along the shelves, reading the labels. She didn't touch anything with her hands and didn't ask questions out loud, and that spoke louder than any conversation. The young man with the broken knuckle sat on a box by the entrance, staring at his phone, its screen dark. His name was Im Chang-ho, judging by the patch on his jacket, and he was dead weight here until he proved otherwise. Minhun gave them 7 minutes. Exactly 7. He counted on his internal timer, which never lied. In 7 minutes, a person either starts acting or freezes completely, and that's already a diagnosis. By the 7th minute, Yoon-ji was holding a notebook from her jacket pocket and writing something in it. By the 7th minute, Kwon Tae-young was already figuring out how to load the DGU-15 into the truck bed and whether they needed a second person. Minhun walked over to Kwon, stood beside him, and looked at the generator with him without saying a word. Without turning around, Kwon asked, "What exactly is the address at 38 Tahakno, and why specifically there?" His voice was low and steady, like that of a man who asks a question once and waits for an answer once. Minhun said, "A 5-story building, a former office complex. The first floor has 38-centimeter thick brick walls." He said the roof was flat and could support equipment, and that the water tank on the top floor was still operational. He said the perimeter of the courtyard was 140 meters, and that on 3 sides there were solid walls of neighboring buildings. Kwon remained silent while Minjun spoke, and it was the right kind of silence. Not empty, but a working silence. Then he asked one thing. Where did this information about the site come from, and when was the last inspection conducted? Minhun smiled quietly. He said he had inspected it personally, and that the figures could be trusted. Kwon looked at him directly for the first time, studying him the way one studies a map before an operation. He asked nothing more. He simply said that 2 people could load the DGU-15, but a third was needed for the DGU-30. This signified agreement, not in words but in action, and it was precisely this kind of agreement that held real value. So Eun approached on her own. She showed him a notebook. It contained a 2-column list with numbers and abbreviations. The left column was what was in stock. The right column was what she estimated would be needed for the first 72 hours. Minjun scanned the list and found 3 discrepancies with his own internal calculations. 2 of the discrepancies were insignificant. The third was important. She had counted the water and he hadn't. He looked at her. He asked what she did for a living. She said, "Medical supply logistics for 5 years." That explained the notebook and the columns and the way she read the labels on the shelves without emotion. Minjung said she would go in the first vehicle, and that the list needed to be expanded to cover another 96 hours. She was already writing before he had finished his last word, and that, too, was a good sign. Im Chang-ho got up from the crate and said he wanted to know the plan, and that he was tired of listening to conversations without him. He said this loudly, with the resentment of someone who feels he is being deliberately ignored. Minhun glanced at him and sized him up in 2 seconds. His hands, jacket, shoes, posture, and eyes. His hands had no calluses. His jacket was expensive but had been dirty for 2 days straight. His shoes were dress shoes without heels. He asked Chang-ho if he knew how to drive a manual transmission car, and Chang-ho said yes, he did. Minhun tossed him the keys to the porter and said the first trip was for the generator and medical supplies. He said Chang-ho was going with So Eun-ji, that they'd unload on site and head right back for the second trip. Chang-ho caught the keys and said nothing. His anger remained, but had turned into determination, and that was all that was needed. Kwon Tae-young stepped right up to Min-jun as the two headed toward the car and spoke quietly and without preamble. He said he'd seen people like this, people who know the target in advance and move without hesitation or panic. He said he needed to know one thing. Was Min-jun working for someone else or just for himself? Outside, Porter started up, and somewhere far beyond the fence, the first serious siren of the day began to wail. Min-hun looked at Kwon calmly. He said, "Only the result matters, and you can verify that in action." Kwon looked at him for another 3 seconds. Then he nodded once and walked toward the DGU-30 generator. The time was 11:08. There were 9 hours and 52 minutes left until the power went out, and there was plenty of work to be done. Min-hun took a coil of steel wire from the rack, slung it over his shoulder, and followed. Tahakno 38 looked exactly as Min-jun remembered it, gray brick with a damp patch above the 3rd floor. The porter was already standing in the courtyard, and Seo Eun-ji and Chang-ho were carrying boxes through the side door on the 1st floor. Kwon Tae-young got out of the truck and immediately walked along the perimeter of the courtyard without saying a word, just as he should. Min-hun stood in the middle of the courtyard and gave himself exactly 2 minutes to take in everything that had changed since his previous life. The east wall of the neighboring building had a crack running from the foundation up to the 2nd floor. That hadn't been there before. The drain pipe along the north wall was new, plastic instead of metal, and that changed the fasteners. The entrance gate was wooden, not metal, and that was at least twice as bad as he'd expected. He noted 3 changes in his head and rearranged his priorities over the next 40 seconds while standing motionless. Kwon returned 4 minutes later and reported without preamble. The south corner was weak. There was no support for the section. He said the east gate was held by 2 hinges, and one hinge had already snapped and was hanging by a thread. He said that if the pressure from the outside was above average, the gate would give way at the first serious impact. Min-hun nodded. He said the gate was the top priority, and that sheet metal from the warehouse was being sent there immediately. They worked non-stop. Kwon held the sheet of metal, while Min-hun drilled fasteners directly into the wooden frame. A screwdriver was found in the back of the porter. One of the previous owners had left it in the box under the seat. 4 2mm sheets on the gate. Then a metal angle bar across the panels like a crossbeam. Time, 12:33. The gate was transformed. Not perfect, but sufficient for the first 48 hours. So-in appeared in the courtyard with a notepad and said there was a water problem inside that needed to be addressed. She said the water tank on the roof was working, but the water was only reaching the 2nd floor and above. The 1st floor is cut off from the water supply because someone shut off the valve in the basement, and the valve has rusted solid. Min-jung said that the 1st floor is a storage area and a medical station, and that there won't be anyone there. The problem is resolved. She looked at him with that expression a person has when they accept an answer, but don't close the subject completely. Then she said that 7 people had already gone up to the 2nd and 3rd floors while they were working in the courtyard. The 7 people were neighbors and passers-by who saw the open doors and simply walked inside. Min-jung set down his screwdriver and went inside, and Kwon followed without waiting for an invitation. 7 people in the 2nd floor hallway, different ages, different faces, but all with the same expression. An elderly woman with a dog on a leash, 2 teenagers about 16 with backpacks, a middle-aged man with a suitcase, a young mother holding a child of about 3 in her arms, another man, an old man of about 70 with a cane. Min-hun looked at them for exactly 7 seconds and did what he knew how to do. He assessed each person's worth. The elderly woman with the dog was dead weight, plus 1 extra mouth to feed, plus noise at the wrong moment. The 2 teenagers, potential if given a task with a clear outcome and a strict deadline. The man with the suitcase, his hands, shoulders, and gaze, a former laborer or construction worker, and that's a resource right now. A young mother is a liability in combat and an asset in a civilian structure, and for now, the latter is more important than the former. The old man with a cane looked at Min Jun more calmly than anyone else, and that was unexpected and interesting. Min Jun spoke, briefly and without preamble, as one does when there's no time for a gentle introduction. He said the building would close in 2 hours, and that no new people would be allowed inside after closing. He said there was food and water, that there was work for everyone, and that no one would feed freeloaders. The man with the suitcase asked who had put him in charge, and his voice wasn't angry, but tired. His name was Park Yong-soo. He introduced himself, which already suggested that he was used to negotiations. Min-hun said that no one had put him in charge, that the door was open, and that it was up to each person to leave or stay. Park Yong-soo looked at him for 4 seconds. He set his suitcase on the floor. He asked where extra hands were needed. The old man with the cane quietly said his name was Oh Ji-soo, and that he had worked as a foreman for 30 years. He said this without an accent, without pretense, simply as a fact that might prove useful. Min-hun looked at him and smiled quietly, because fate sometimes wraps gifts in strange ways. He told Ji-soo that he was needed on the roof, that they would talk there, and that they would head up in 10 minutes. The time was 1:17 p.m. In the courtyard lay 8 more sheets of metal, 4 rolls of mesh, and 2 bags of fasteners. There were 8 hours and 43 minutes left until the power went out in the Eastern District, and a third of the perimeter was ready. Min-hun returned to the courtyard, picked up the next sheet, called out to Kwan, and they continued without a word. Outside the gate, the street was beginning to sound different, not yet alarming, but no longer entirely peaceful. Ji-soo climbed the stairs slowly but without stopping, holding his cane as a tool rather than a support. Min-jung followed behind, watching how the old man moved his feet and drawing conclusions that satisfied him. A man who had walked construction sites for 30 years knew what effort was and what results were, without needing words. The roof opened up on the 5th bay, a flat tarred surface measuring 22 by 18 meters with an 80-centimeter parapet. Ji-soo stepped onto the roof and immediately walked along the parapet, tapping the masonry with his knuckles. He didn't look at the horizon, nor did he look at the smoke that was now rising from 3 points above the city. He looked at the parapet and the joints, at where the mortar was crumbling and where it was holding, and that was the right way to look. 3 minutes later he said, "The northwest corner is weak and needs to be reinforced with rebar before it's loaded." Min-jung was already standing there, looking at the same spot, and the numbers matched his own assessment exactly. He asked Ji-soo how many people it would take to bring the roof perimeter up to a functional defensive level. The old man paused for about 10 seconds, looking at the parapet and calculating something without paper or a calculator. Then he said, 4 men, 3 days of work, and the materials already down below. 3 days was a long time. Min-jun had less than 3 days left until the countdown ended, and the roof wasn't the top priority. He told Ji-soo that they had 2 hours today, and that they needed the minimum that would provide maximum protection. Ji-soo looked at him without resentment, the way one looks at a client who sets poor conditions but pays. He said, "Then the northwest corner needs rebar and a cross-tie. That's the absolute minimum." Min-hun nodded and called out to Kwan from the stairs, loudly but without shouting, using just the right amount of volume. Kwan appeared 40 seconds later, with a coil of rebar wire slung over his shoulder, as if he already knew what it was for. Ji-soo looked at the wire and at Kwan, and said they needed 4 more 12-millimeter rebar rods, each 2 meters long. Kwan turned and went downstairs without a word, and that was the very kind of working harmony that money can't buy. While Kwan was gone, Min-jun stood at the southern edge of the roof and looked down at the city from the 5th floor. 3 columns of smoke. One was rising rapidly. It was the Sinchon district, where there was an 8-story shopping center. The second column stood motionless over the industrial zone by the river. Most likely a warehouse or factory was on fire. The third was thin and white, and Min-jun knew what that meant. Someone was burning something on purpose, not by accident. Voices could be heard from below in the courtyard. Park Yeon-soo was directing the loading, and his voice was commanding. That was good. A man who knows how to give orders on a construction site knows how to give orders wherever extra hands are needed. Min-hoon noted this and mentally moved Park from the resource category to the junior coordinator category. The structure was taking shape on its own, not because the people were special, but because pressure reveals form. Kwon returned with the rebar, followed by one of the teenagers carrying a bag of fasteners. No one had asked him to. The teenager's name was Kim Jun-so, and he dragged the bag in silence, watching his step and breathing evenly. Oh-ji-soo took the rebar and began explaining the tying angle to Kwon, and Kwon listened without asking questions and did exactly as instructed. Min-hun looked at the teenager and asked if he knew how to read construction blueprints, even just the basics. Kim Jun-so raised his head and said that there had been a technical club at school and that he probably knew a little. That probably wasn't an answer, but coming from a guy who showed up with a bag of fasteners without being asked, it was an answer. Min-hun said that after the roof, Jun-so would go to So-eun-ji and help with the inventory until evening. The teenager nodded, set the bag down next to Oh-ji-soo, and stood so he could be helpful without getting in the way. The work on the northwest corner took 40 minutes. Oh-ji-soo tied the rebar without fuss or haste. Kwon held the rods at the right angle and did so with such precision as if he'd been working on construction sites his whole life. The parapet in the corner had changed, not new but alive, and that's a difference you can only feel with your hands. Oh-ji-soo stepped back, examined the joint, and said one word. It holds, and added nothing more. Meanwhile, Min-jun was walking across the roof, measuring it with his steps, and checking the lines of sight from each side. The north side offered a view 200 meters to the intersection, and that was the main observation point. The south side abutted the neighboring building 12 meters away. A spotlight was needed there, not an observer. The west side looked out onto a vacant lot, and the vacant lot was a problem because there was nowhere to hide there. He stopped on the north side and looked down at the street, taking in what he saw without emotion. 3 pedestrians carrying bags were walking quickly north. One man stood by the wall, looking at his phone. A car drove by at 70 kilometers per hour, and that was the speed of a man who had already figured everything out. And one infected person was walking slowly down the middle of the street, and none of the 3 pedestrians had noticed him yet. Min-hun smiled quietly, not at them, but at how precisely the world was repeating itself according to the script. He turned and told Kwon that a permanent observation post was needed on the north side, starting tonight. He said the shifts would be 4 hours long, and that Kwon would take the first night himself because he was training the others. Kwon looked down at the street, at the infected man, and at the 3 pedestrians, and said only, "Understood." Time, 14:52. Power outage in 7 hours and 8 minutes. Generators are downstairs. Fuel has been accounted for. 2/3 of the courtyard perimeter is ready. The roof is minimally covered. People are in position and moving. Min-hun was the first to climb down from the roof and stopped on the 3rd floor by the west-facing window. The vacant lot was empty for now. He looked at it for 3 seconds and memorized what it looked like when empty. The vacant lot bothered Min-hun not because of its size, but its shape. Long and narrow, it ran along the west wall. 80 meters long and 20 wide, with not a single obstacle taller than a knee along its entire length. At night, it was a corridor. During the day, it was a firing zone. In both cases, it was an exposed vulnerability. He stood by the third-floor west window, looking at the vacant lot and thinking about what to do with it in 7 hours. In his past life, the vacant lot had become a problem on the 8th day. The horde had come from exactly there and exactly at night. Back then, he had neither the time, nor the materials, nor the people with the right skills, and the wall hadn't been built in time. Now he had materials. Now he had workers. Now he had Ogisu, who knew what rapid masonry was. He turned and went downstairs, not because he had come up with a plan, but because the plan was already formed inside him. In the courtyard, Park Yeon-soo was finishing his third trip, silently unloading the last sheets of metal from the porter. Min-hun approached and said that the metal wasn't going to the warehouse but to the west side, and explained why. Park Yeon-soo listened without asking questions, shifted the first sheet onto his shoulder, and headed toward the west gate on his own. That was the right thing to do. A person who understood the task doesn't wait for confirmation of every step. Gi-soo appeared in the courtyard a minute later. He was coming down slowly but already wearing work gloves and carrying a probe. Min-hun pointed out the vacant lot beyond the west gate and explained the task in a single, concise sentence. The old man looked at the vacant lot for a long time, not with confusion, but with the professional gaze one casts on a budget before signing it. Then he said, "If not masonry, then rebar trestles, plus chain-link fencing, plus anchors in the asphalt." The trestles were quick to set up and would suffice for the first 3 days, so Min-jun said, "Go ahead." Ogi-soo called over Park Yeon-soo, Kwon, and Kim Jun-so, and explained the task to them, briefly and without repetition. Min-hun stepped back and let the old man work because a good foreman doesn't need supervision from above. He went back inside the building because it was now closed off outside, but not yet inside. The second floor greeted him with the smell of someone else's food and quiet voices from a room far to the right. An elderly woman with a dog was sitting by the window, feeding the dog something from a bag and looking out at the street. A young mother with a child had settled in the corner of the hallway on a jacket, and the child was sleeping on her lap. Min-hun walked past them without stopping and reached the room where the voices were coming from, then pushed the door open. So-in-ji was sitting at the table, and across from her sat the man Min-jung hadn't left here. A man of about 38 in a medical scrub with the city clinic's logo on his left shoulder. He spoke quickly and quietly, keeping his hands open on the table, which meant he hadn't come with any threats. So-in-ji saw Min-jun and said, "He arrived an hour ago. He's a doctor, and his name is Yoon Seok-chun." Yoon Seok-chun turned and looked at Min-jun without fear or flattery. He was simply waiting to be assessed. He said he had been working in the emergency room at the city clinic, and that the clinic had completely collapsed 3 hours ago. He said he had left through the service exit and walked aimlessly until he saw people who were working rather than fleeing. He stated the last sentence as a matter of fact, but it contained a question he didn't voice aloud. Min-jun looked at him for 7 seconds. His sweater was clean despite 3 hours on the street, meaning he had moved wisely. His hands had no cuts and weren't shaking, meaning he'd left the clinic before things got really bad there. His eyes were tired but not empty, a man who'd seen terrible things today but hadn't been broken by what he'd seen. Min-hun said that the medical station was on the 1st floor and that So-un-ji would show him where the medical supplies were kept. Yoon Seok-chun stood up and asked one question. Were there already injured people here, or was it just a precautionary measure for now? Min-hun said it was just a precaution for now, but that would change by evening, and told him to prepare for field conditions. The doctor nodded and looked at So-yun-ji, who was already getting up from her chair with a notepad under her arm. They walked out together, and in the hallway, their voices immediately turned businesslike, which was right, and which was necessary. Min-hun sat down in the now vacant chair, closed his eyes for 40 seconds, and took stock of what he had. Kwon, defense and perimeter. So-yun-ji, logistics and accounting. Park Yeon-soo, manual labor and coordination. Oh Gi-soo, construction and engineering. Kim Jun-so, liaison and support. Yoon Seok-chun, medicine. Im Chang-ho, transportation, as long as there's fuel and roads. 7 people with specific roles. The rest are dead weight for now. He opened his eyes. He stood up. He walked to the window and looked down at the western wasteland. Om Gi-soo was already setting the first support. The rebar was going into the asphalt at a precise angle, without any unnecessary movements. Park Young-soo was unrolling a roll of mesh, and Kwon was holding the section taut while the old man secured the anchor. Min-hun smiled quietly. In 7 hours, this wasteland would no longer look the same. Time: 3:44 p.m. 6 hours and 16 minutes until the power goes out. Outside, sirens were already wailing continuously. The hordes wouldn't come today. He knew that for sure. But stragglers were already roaming about, and their numbers were growing. The next 2 hours would be spent on the western barrier, the medical unit, and one thing he'd been putting off since morning. The list of people he hadn't included, and who knew the address and could come here on their own without an invitation. 2 people knew the address. Lee Bo-min, from the pharmacy at 14 Cheono. Min-hun had given it to him himself that morning at the counter. And Im Chang-ho, who had overheard the conversation by the warehouse and was now behind the wheel of the porter in 3rd gear. Chang-ho was inside and under control. Lee Bo-min was outside and unknown, and that was an unknown variable. Min-jung sat by the 2nd floor window and thought about the pharmacist exactly as much as the task required. Lee Bo-min was 55 years old, with the hands of a counter and the eyes of a man accustomed to surviving quietly. He took the money and the phone, handed over the medication, didn't call the police, and didn't ask any unnecessary questions. This was the portrait of a man who knew how to assess a situation and act precisely in his own best interests. Such a man would either come to the address or walk away, and both options were acceptable. The problem wasn't Lee Bo-min. The problem was that the address could spread further through him to others. The pharmacist could have told a neighbor or a relative or a random person in a panic on the stairwell, and then by nightfall, it might not be 2 acquaintances but 20 strangers at the gate on 38 Taehak Row. 20 strangers at the gate are not guests. It's a decision that cannot be made hastily and without rules. Min-hun stood up and went down to the 1st floor, where Yoon Seok-chun was already sorting the medications by category. The doctor worked methodically. Antibiotics separate, painkillers separate, bandages separate. He looked up when Min-hun entered and waited silently, a sign of a disciplined man. Min-hun said that people might show up at the gate by evening and asked how many beds could be set up on the 1st floor. Yoon Seok-chun surveyed the room and said, 8 beds, if we move the partition and remove 2 shelves. He said that a field medical unit needed at least 1 more person with basic training on staff at all times. Min-hun said that the teenager Kim Jun-so would be joining him after he finished with the supplies. Yoon Seok-chun nodded and went back to sorting. He didn't ask any more questions. This was the right man for the job. Min-hun went out into the courtyard. The porter drove through the gate, and Im Chang-ho stepped out of the cab with a pale face. Not sick, frightened. The pallor came from what he'd seen outside, not from illness, and that was the difference. He said that a car had overturned on Cheono, and that a crowd of about 40 people was standing at the Mapo Bridge crossing. He said this quickly and waited for a reaction, the way one waits when bad news has been delivered and you want it taken away. Min-hun asked if the people at the crossing were moving or standing still. Chang-ho said they were standing and looking east. He asked if there were any infected in that crowd. Chang-ho said he couldn't tell. It was too far away and dark under the bridge. Min-jun nodded and told Chang-ho there would be no next run, and that Porter would be stationed in the courtyard until morning. Chang-ho exhaled, not with relief, but with the kind of exhaustion that builds up when you've been doing something terrible for a long time. Kwon appeared at the west gate and said the barrier was 60% complete and the pace was holding steady. He said the tripods were anchored and the netting was stretched 40 meters out of the 80 needed. He said it was getting dark early and that the last 2 hours of daylight had to be used without wasting any time on breaks. Minhun said he had 20 minutes for one task and that afterward he would go out to the west wall. He went up to the 3rd floor and found an empty room with a north-facing window and closed the door behind him. He needed to think about the rule he was supposed to announce tonight to everyone, without exception. The rule was simple and cruel, and he knew it, which was exactly why he had been putting it off since morning. After the gates closed at 10 p.m., no new people were allowed inside. None at all. Under no circumstances. He knew this rule would kill someone outside, perhaps several, perhaps those who were close. He knew this in his past life, too, and back then, he opened the gates once, at 1 in the morning, for 3 strangers. The 3 strangers brought in an infected person who showed no symptoms for another 8 hours. By the 9th hour, 14 people had died inside, and among them was the group's only doctor. Minhun stood by the window and looked north, where the sky over Sinchon had turned orange from the fire. He felt no doubt. He felt the weight of decisions that could not be appealed. It was a different experience, and he knew the difference. Doubt paralyzes. Weight. It only presses down, and pressure can be borne. He turned and went downstairs, stopping on the 2nd floor and summoning everyone into the hallway with a single command. Everyone came. Kwan, with dirty hands. So Eun-ji, with a notebook. Park Yeon-soo, with rebar dust on his shoulder. Oh Gi-soo leaned on his cane and looked straight ahead. Yoon Sok-chun stood in the doorway with his arms crossed. Kim Jun-so stood next to Seo Eun-ji and said nothing. Im Chang-ho stood apart and stared at the floor. An elderly woman with a dog, a young mother with a child, and an old man from the north. They had all come and were all listening. Minhun stated the rule once, without repeating it, without softening it, and without explaining the reasons aloud. The gates close at 10 p.m. After that, they do not open until dawn for anyone, no matter what is said. The young mother raised her head and asked quietly, "What if one of our people doesn't make it back by 10? Minjung looked at her and said that after 10 p.m., none of our people should be outside. The elderly woman said that this was inhumane, that people don't do things like that, and that a solution can always be found. She spoke confidently and with the moral conviction of people who have never had to pay for their decisions. Minhun let her finish. Then he said she could leave before 10 p.m. and that no one was stopping her. She fell silent. The dog at her feet whimpered quietly once and also fell silent, as if it understood the rule. Time, 4:29 p.m. 5 hours and 31 minutes until the gates close. 5 hours and 31 minutes until the lights go out. Minhun went down to the courtyard, picked up a roll of wire mesh, and headed toward the west wall where Kwan was waiting. Behind him in the hallway, people were dispersing in silence, and the silence was not one of resentment, but of work. That was the only quality of the silence that mattered now. The western barrier was closed at 6:47 p.m. The last anchor sank into the asphalt as the sky was already losing its color. 80 meters of mesh on rebar trestles, plus 2 sheets of metal at the junction with the north wall. Not perfect. Good enough. And the difference between those 2 words was now the only measure of quality. Om Gi-soo was the last to inspect the barrier. He said it held and turned toward the gate without another word. Minjung stayed by the barrier for another 2 minutes, staring at the wasteland through the mesh in the graying air. The wasteland was empty. That didn't mean it would remain empty in an hour, and he had to keep that in mind. He turned and walked into the courtyard, bolted the west gate shut, and checked the bolt twice with his hand. Time, 6:51 p.m. 3 hours and 9 minutes until the main gate closed. 3 hours and 9 minutes until dawn. The generators were located on the first floor in a back room with ventilation through a broken window to the outside. Quan had run a cable from the DGU-15 earlier that day, around the perimeter of the first floor to the distribution panel. The second generator was a backup, and they had agreed not to touch it or approach it without orders. Min-hun walked over to the DGU-15 and checked the fuel level himself, and the number matched what Quan had said. Enough fuel for 38 hours of continuous operation at the current load. The load consisted of lighting on 2 floors. If they added the medical unit at full power, those 38 hours would become 29, and that would change the resource calculations. Min-hun stood by the generator and thought about the fuel for exactly as long as he needed to make a decision. Lighting only in the medical unit and the hallways. The living quarters would use flashlights. That would save 9 hours. So-in appeared in the doorway with a notepad and said there were 14 lanterns in inventory. She said the batteries would last for 2 full cycles, and that after that, it would be dark, and that needed to be addressed separately. Min-jung said that the first task tomorrow morning would be candles and batteries, and that she should make the list now. She had already started writing before he finished his sentence and left without waiting for confirmation. That's right. At 7:22 p.m., the lights in the Eastern District flickered once and went out. Min-jun was standing by the window and saw it. The city didn't go dark all at once. It went out in sections, like the lights in a theater dim before the start of a serious act. First, the east. Then, 4 minutes later, the north. Then the west, in large squares, one after another. Their district held out for another 11 minutes and then, too, slipped into darkness without warning and without a sound. The DGU-15 started up on the first try, and that was the one thing that day that went exactly according to plan. The corridors on the first and second floors were lit by yellow work lights, and it was ugly and sufficient. Outside, the city had changed, dark and quiet, with rare flashes of headlights and distant, wordless screams. Min-jun listened to these screams for 30 seconds, determining the direction, distance, and nature of each one. 3 screams were human and panicked, far to the north and not getting closer. One sound was not a scream. It was a drawn-out, unfinished sound that only the infected make. It came from the east and was solitary, and Min-jung estimated the distance to be 300 meters, give or take 50. Quan stood nearby listening as well and raised 2 fingers. He had heard the same thing and agreed. At 8:15 p.m., the first person from outside arrived at the gate. Min-jung was on the roof with Quan when it happened. Kim Jun-so shouted from below that a man was standing at the gate, knocking and saying he knew the pharmacy owner. Min-hun and Quan exchanged glances. Lee Bo-min had come on his own, earlier than Min-hun had expected and not alone. He walked down from the roof at a steady pace, picked up a lantern on the first floor, and walked toward the gate without hurrying. Standing outside the gate was Lee Bo-min with 2 large bags, and next to him was a woman in her 50s. The woman was holding the hand of a girl of about 12, and the girl was holding a small backpack with both hands. Lee Bo-min said that they were his sister and her daughter, and that he couldn't have come without them, and wouldn't have. He spoke quickly and apologetically, and every word showed that he feared rejection more than the darkness. Min-jung shone the lantern on all 3 of them in turn. Bo-min's bags were heavy, medicines. He had brought the pharmacist along and kept that in mind when giving the address, and the pharmacist didn't let him down on the main point. His sister remained composed, no hysterics, no tears, just a woman who had decided to go and had come. The girl looked straight at Min-jung and didn't avert her gaze, which was unexpected for a 12-year-old. Min-jung opened the gate and told them to come in, explaining that the bags would go to the medical ward and that they would see a doctor first. Lee Bo-min started saying that they were healthy, that there were no bites, and that they could just take his word for it. Min-jung looked at him calmly and said one thing. Yoon Suk-chun is on the first floor to the left, and that's not up for discussion. Lee Bo-min fell silent, picked up the bags, and went inside, and the nurse and the girl followed without objection. The time was 8:31 p.m., 1 hour and 29 minutes until the gates closed. Outside, it was pitch black. Min Jung stood by the open gate for another 30 seconds, gazing into the darkness of the street in front of the building. No one. Only the wind and a distant, drawn-out sound that had grown slightly closer than it had been 20 minutes ago. He closed the gate, slid the bolt into place, and checked it twice with his hand as always, then went inside. Yoon Sok-chun examined all three of them in 12 minutes and came out to meet Min Jun in the hallway with a blank expression. The doctor's blank expression after the examination meant one thing, and Min Jun nodded before the doctor even opened his mouth. Sok-chun spoke anyway, quietly and professionally. No bites, no scratches, everyone's temperature is normal. He said the girl was dehydrated and needed electrolytes today and tomorrow, and that was non-negotiable. Lee Bo-min had brought more than just what was on the morning list in his bags. He had brought extra items, and that was important. Insulin, 2 vials. The cold chain had been broken, but according to Sok-chun's assessment, they would still be usable for the next few days. 3 additional vials of adrenaline. 4 packages of baby food. No one asked for them, but he brought them anyway. Min-hun looked at the contents of the bags and thought that the pharmacist had been thinking of others while carrying his own supplies, and that was fine. Time, 9:03 p.m., 57 minutes until the gates close. He climbed onto the roof and stood at the northern edge. The city below was dark and motionless, as only the dead or the lurking can be. Rare headlights on distant streets, a single window with a candle in the house across the way, a person, or a person's habit. Kwan stood guard at the northern parapet, staring into the darkness, and did not turn around when Min Jun came out. Without turning, he said, "2 people have been standing at the eastern corner for 8 minutes now, and haven't moved." Min-hun stood beside him and looked at the same spot, and after 30 seconds he made out 2 silhouettes by the wall. They stood too still for living people who were cold and afraid in the darkness without light. But they didn't move in the characteristic way of those infected in the first wave. Too upright, too quiet. Kwan said quietly that this was the 3rd type, the ones who stand and wait, and he had seen them once before today. Min-hun smiled quietly, not because it was good news, but because he knew this type. The 3rd type had appeared on the 4th day in his past life, and the fact that it had appeared on the 1st day changed everything. He stood by the railing, counting the days on his internal calendar, and he didn't like the new numbers at all. At 9:34 p.m., more people arrived at the gate. Not 1, not 3. Kim Jun-so shouted from below that there were 7 of them. Min-hun slowly climbed down from the roof, grabbed a flashlight, walked up to the gate, and shone it through the slit. 7 people, different ages, different faces, but one thing in common. They had come as a group, and that was already a structure. A structure from the outside meant that someone had led them there, and someone was making the decisions, and that someone was standing at the front. Standing in front of them was a man in his 40s, with broad shoulders and that particular calmness of a well-fed predator. He said he'd heard about this place from someone who'd heard it from someone else, and that they were looking for shelter. He spoke confidently, with no hint of pleading in his voice, the way people do who are used to getting what they ask for. Behind him, 6 people stood in silence, and this silence was not one of fear but of waiting for a command, and that was bad. Min Jung shone his flashlight on each of them in turn, slowly and without haste, and assessed what he saw. 2 large men with hands unaccustomed to office work, perhaps construction workers, perhaps worse. A woman in her 30s with a vacant stare, the kind that comes after shock or after a decision has been made. A teenager of about 17 with a split lip. He'd been hit recently, and he hadn't started this conversation. 2 more stood in the back so they couldn't be seen clearly, and that was the only thing that mattered. People who hide at first contact are either afraid or preparing for something, and both scenarios demanded a response. Min-hun lowered his flashlight and said there were no spots, and that the situation would be reassessed in the morning by daylight. The man in front said they wouldn't leave, that it was dark outside, and that he knew there was room inside. He spoke calmly, and that was worse than if he had been shouting, because his calmness was calculated. He said there were 7 of them, that they could be useful, and that it was foolish to keep people outside the gate at a time like this. Every word he spoke was the right word, and that is precisely why every word he spoke was the wrong sign. The right words in the wrong order from a man with 2 people hidden behind him, that's a threat. Minhun stood by the gate and didn't answer, and behind him in the darkness of the hallway, Quan was already standing. He knew it. Quan stepped out silently and stood 2 meters behind him, and that was a deliberate position, not a coincidence, and it was right. The man outside was waiting for an answer, and his composure was beginning to crack at the edges, just a little, but noticeably. Minhun said one last thing. The gate closes at 10 p.m., and this rule stands until dawn, with no exceptions. The man said he would remember that, and that they would return, and his voice had changed. It was no longer a facade. Minhun didn't reply. He stepped back from the gate and nodded to Quan, and Quan slid the extra bolt into place from above. There were voices outside for another minute. Not shouts, but conversation, then footsteps, and then silence. The silence was ominous, not empty, but deferred, like a debt that isn't forgiven, but put off until later. The time was 9:58 p.m. Minjun stood by the gate and waited until exactly 10 p.m. And at 10 p.m., he told Quan, "It's closed." Quan checked all 3 bolts, one by one, checking each twice, then stepped back and stood silently beside him. Outside in the darkness, a drawn-out sound from the east grew closer. No longer 300 meters away, but less than 100. Minhun listened to it and thought about the broad-shouldered man and the 2 people hiding behind his back. The 3rd type of infected on the first day. The group with the leader at the gate on the first night. The timeline had shifted. He didn't have 73 hours left from the moment he woke up. He had less, and the new numbers demanded new decisions. He smiled quietly, standing in the darkness of the corridor with a flashlight in his hand, and Quan glanced at him silently. There were 6 hours until dawn, and each one was worth more than it had been yesterday in another life. The first 2 hours after the gates closed were the quietest hours of the entire day, and that was a bad sign. Silence on the first night of the apocalypse does not mean peace. It means that everything alive is lying in wait. Minhun knew this, which is why he didn't sleep or sit down, but walked the perimeter of the first floor every 20 minutes. Quan was on the roof. Park Yeon-soo dozed by the inner door with a rebar bar across his knees. Just right. At 11:14 p.m., an infected from the east reached the north wall, and Quan reported from above without panic. 1. Slow. Banging against the wall at a single point and not looking for a way around. The classic first type without navigation. Minhun climbed onto the roof, looked down, and confirmed that it was exactly as Quan had said, and nothing more. The infected one was banging his palms against the brick wall methodically and to no avail, and it could be ignored until morning. He went back down and walked to the medical ward, where the only bright light in the building was burning that night. Yoon Seok-chun wasn't sleeping. He was sitting at a table reading something handwritten on pages from So Yoonji's notebook. The girl, Lee Bo-min, was sleeping on the first bed with an IV in her hand. The electrolytes were flowing slowly and steadily. Bo-min sat next to her on a chair, sleeping while sitting up, the kind of sleep a person has when they won't allow themselves to lie down. Minhun sat down across from Sok-chun and spoke quietly so as not to wake the sleepers, asking about the insulin. Sok-chun said that the cold chain had been broken for about 8 hours, and that the drug's potency had decreased by about 20%. He said that if they could find a cool place, a basement or an unheated north-facing room, the drug would last longer. Minjung said there was a basement, and that the first task tomorrow morning would be to check the temperature in the basement with a thermometer. Sokchun paused and then said, without looking at his notes, "Among those who came today, there is a type 2 diabetic." He said an elderly woman with a dog had told him this in the evening while he was making his rounds. He said she had a 3-day supply of her pills, and that after that, it would become his problem and everyone's problem. Minhun nodded and added the elderly woman to the to-do list, and the list grew by 1 line. At 12:40 a.m., Im Chang-ho knocked on the door of the medical unit and walked in, his face bearing the look of someone who hadn't slept and had been struggling. He sat down in an empty chair and was silent for a long time, and Minjun didn't rush him because there was no need to. Then Chang-ho said he'd seen something outside on his last run and hadn't mentioned it right away on purpose. Minjun looked at him calmly and waited, and the silence between them was businesslike, not hostile. Chang-ho said that at the Mapodero crossing there was a crowd of 40 people. Not infected, but living, frightened people. He said there were children among them, and that they were standing under the bridge, burning something in a trash can for warmth. He said he drove past because Minjung had told him to, and that it was probably the right thing to do, but it weighed heavily on him. He spoke the last word quietly, with an intonation that signaled he was seeking permission, not advice. Minjung thought for 8 seconds. Then he said that 40 people weren't a group. They were an unstructured crowd. He said that a mob without structure under the bridge would either disperse by dawn or form its own leader. He said that if it formed a leader before dawn, the leader would lead it somewhere in search of resources. Chang-ho listened, and you could tell from his face that he understood where this conversation was going, and he didn't like it. Minhun said that at dawn he would personally go to the crossing and see what was left of this crowd by morning. He said that if there were people in charge there, he would talk to them. If there was chaos, he would leave. He said that Chang-ho was going with him because he knew the way and because it would relieve the pressure. Chang-ho exhaled and nodded, and it wasn't enthusiasm. It was the relief of a man who had been given a task. At 2:30 a.m., Minjun went up to the roof to relieve Quan and sent him to bed without objection or discussion. Quan left without a word, and it was trust expressed through action, the only kind that had any value. Minhun stood at the northern parapet, looking out at the dark city and taking stock of what he saw and what he didn't. The infected man by the north wall was still pounding his palms against the brick, methodically, dully, endlessly. The 2 silhouettes at the east corner had vanished. This could mean many things, and none of them were good. The broad-shouldered leader had left, not because he had accepted the refusal, but because he had found another vantage point. Minhun stood in the cold wind and thought about the 3rd type of infected, those who stand and wait and don't scream. They appeared on the 1st day. In his previous life, they appeared on the 4th. The difference was 3 days. 3 days meant that the virus had mutated faster, or that the strain this time was different from the very beginning. Both possibilities changed everything he knew about the timeline, the behavior of the hordes, and when the present would arrive. He stood on the roof, gazing into the darkness, and went over every point of his plan with the new parameters. 73 hours from waking up had become a different number, smaller and harsher, with no room for error now. Dawn was 3 hours and 40 minutes away. Down below, people were sleeping, unaware that the calendar had shifted. Minhun wasn't going to tell them until morning, not because he was hiding anything, but because at night, it's just fear. In the morning, it would become a task. Fear and a task look the same only until there is a plan. He had a plan. He went over it while standing in the wind, and each time he did, it made him feel tighter and colder. Dawn came at 5:47 a.m., gray and cold, without a single sound from the birds. The birds had left before the people, as always. Minhun came down from the roof and woke Chang-ho with a brief touch on the shoulder, and Chang-ho got up immediately without asking any questions. That was a good sign. A man who gets up without asking questions on the first night of the apocalypse has already changed. 3 days ago, this Chang-ho would have been different. This Chang-ho was raw material, and that mattered. Kwon appeared in the hallway a minute later. He hadn't slept, or had slept very little, and had come out on his own without being called. Minjung told him he was leaving for an hour, and that the perimeter and the roof were his responsibility until he returned. No questions asked. Kwon nodded and asked one thing: whether he should take anything with him in case of contact outside at the gate. Minhun said that the infected person by the north wall was still there, and that this was the first task before his return. The porter started the car on the third try. The cold of the night had taken its toll, and this would have to be taken into account in the future. Minhun sat in the passenger seat and Chang-ho drove. If you're interested in the continuation and how this manhwa ends, the final part of the story is already available on Patreon, and the link is in the description and pinned comment.